This is a Viva PR podcast.
It's all about how you support people, whether they're the people who are responding or whether they're the people who are facing that crisis situation. It's why we need to invest in comms and PR the whole time, so that the moment something happens, we're in a strong position. Information's being weaponised. Communication is at the front line and put under pressure in a way that I don't think any of us probably have experienced. It takes a long time to build a good reputation and moments to lose it.
On the 22nd of May 2017, a terrorist committed a suicide bombing at the Manchester Arena. 22 people were killed and over 1,000 injured. Within 10 minutes of the bomb going off, Greater Manchester Police's then head of comms, Amanda Coleman, was given the news. In this episode of PR in the Real World, we talked to Amanda about this incident and her career before and since. It's about human tragedy, crisis comms and so much more. So, hello Amanda, and welcome to PR in the Real World.
Hello, it's good to be here.
Let's talk about your career journey first. And, you started in journalism in my hometown of Bolton, really well known for working in the police. But you tell me about this story.
Oh my God, yeah. I mean, I loved it. Your accent always feels like home because I studied in Bolton as well. Right. I went, what is now University of Bolton and was Bolton Institute. I was institutionalised. So the first job was in Bolton, worked in newspapers, which is, it was weird because it's the one thing that I'd always wanted to do. And nobody can ever understand why, because nobody in the family was a journalist. So I don't know what happened to me when I was younger, but ever since primary school, that was the only job I wanted. And I did enjoy it for a period of time, but then I had a series of kind of death knocks and dealing with families and trying to get information, and I sort of fell out of love with it a little bit. And then suddenly found that there was another thing you could do that people were talking about called public relations, which I'd never even thought of. And then moved to work for the Environment Agency, covering the North West, and learning about what this thing called PR kind of was, and how it differed, and what you had to think about, and campaigns and all the other aspects that I had not thought about. And then after a couple of years of doing that, was looking to obviously move on and kind of develop. And then a job came up working with the police, doing communication work, doing with incident-focused kind of work. Yeah. And I suppose it's interested me as an ex-journalist because you're nosy and you want to know what's going on and be kind of at the heart of things. So I went for the interview, which was an interrogation with 3 police officers, which I was not expecting. Yeah. And they could have really shone a light in my face as to why do you want this job? And luckily I was lucky enough after what seemed like a huge amount of time because of vetting processes. I got the job and then...
Where was that?
That was in Merseyside.
Oh, right.
So I was working in Merseyside, and then did about 2.5, 3 years there, and then went to Manchester. So it was 21 years later before I left, which is mad, really. I would never have thought I would have stayed there, because before that point, I'd worked for about 18 months, 2 years in different jobs, and then moved on. But something about policing kind of got me.
And in your role at Manchester, you must have dealt with a lot of interesting, awful, tricky situations. Just tell us a little bit about some of the kind of things that you saw on a day-to-day basis and some of the...
Yeah, I mean, anybody who works in those sorts of environments, it is, I call it like a Marmite job. Which, when I say it to people who are not in the UK, they don't know what Marmite is. But it's either you like it or you hate it. Yeah. And I think, for me, I enjoyed it and I found it. I felt like I was doing something positive, trying to help people and, deal with the kind of help them through difficult points in their lives and dealing with the media at difficult points in their lives. But for some people, it's just not the right kind of job. So, you would have a lot of incidents on a daily basis, lots of kind of serious crime. We went through a period of quite a difficult points where there was riots in 2011, and dealing with that, if anybody remembers kind of what happened then. And then the year after that, 2012, we had two police officers, two police women who were murdered. So that was a really difficult sort of period of time. And then the kind of biggest kind of challenge for me, obviously, was 2017 and the terrorist attack at the Manchester Arena, which which had a much bigger impact on me than I probably realised until, I left the police in 2020.
Are we all right to talk about what kind of happened on that night and just go through, what's it like dealing with a, major incident like that?
Yeah, I mean, the thing with it is it's what's driven me a lot now. So I am kind of comfortable talking about some of it. What I experienced was nothing compared to what families and people who have been dealing with the aftermath of it and live with the aftermath of it. And and my heart goes out to them. And I taught. Funnily enough, I was talking at a conference of emergency planners earlier in the year, and I actually asked the families of two of the victims if I could mention one of the kind of points at me where I think my life, my kind of process of dealing with it changed. And it was there was a couple, a young couple, Chloe and Liam, who both died in the attack. And I'd been very process focused from dealing with the initial aspects of we've got this incident, this is what we need to do, and going through kind of what we'd talked about and sort of prepared for and that kind of thing. And we had tributes that we were putting out on the behalf of the families and that kind of thing. And then the tribute came in and it was a joint one from both families because they were a couple and they were only sort of, I think, like 17, 18. And it was such a kind of emotional statement. It said so much about the couple. I was in, at that point, a relationship with somebody I'd been with from that sort of age, and it really struck home. And that's the bit where I suddenly kind of woke up to, that's what's important here. It's how we support these people that I don't know and have never met, but are dealing with this horrific kind of aftermath. That's more important than anything else that we're kind of doing, and it was a really kind of awakening of, I suppose, the emotional side which I'd suppressed in the time before it. But it's that bit of emotion that when I was talking about it to the emergency planners, that I wanted them to kind of feel, because it's really easy to. Well, I say that it's really easy too because I spend my life doing crisis communication stuff now. So it's kind of easy to go, this is the process and this is the plan and this is the way we approach it. But you've got to prepare and be ready for and focus on the emotional side and the people element, because that's what, for me, with the biggest kind of learning, the bit that I took from that experience and try and instill in my day-to-day now is it's all about how you support people, how you deal with people, whether they're the people who are responding or whether they're the people who are facing that kind of crisis situation. So it was a massively tough time. And but like I say, my experience, my kind of, dealing with it was so much less than so many other people.
You were telling me before we went on air about how you'd gone in and got some counselling or gone to see the occupational health people, and you mentioned it to your boss, and then tell the listeners what happened that day.
It's just it's the little things, isn't it, that I suppose go on in your mind when things happen. So they have to say that the police were really good in recognising that this was going to have a massive impact on a lot of people who had responded or were involved in the response in some way. So they'd basically identified roles where we were told you need to go and speak to occupational health. I spent the whole time going, I don't need to go. I'm fine. And if anybody who worked with me would know that was generally the way I approached a lot of things. I'm fine. It's all fine. We're going to be fine. Which isn't necessarily the best way of dealing with things, because you're not acknowledging what you're dealing with. You're just kind of brushing it off. So I went one early morning to go to occupational health, because then it was almost like nobody would know, because I'd go on the way to work. So by the time I got into work, it'd just be normal and it would be fine, and nobody would look at it. So when I came into the office after going to see the occupational health kind of nurse, the chief constable at the time was in the office and said, "Oh, where have you been this morning?" And I went, "Oh, I've been to occupational health." And he just went, "Oh, okay." And then carried on the rest of the conversation, whatever was happening, and off we went. And then my mind was like, they think I can't cope. They think I can't deal with this. So I remember sending a message going, I'm fine, I'm dealing with this. I'm absolutely fine. And he was like, I never said anything. It was like it hadn't registered to kind of query that I could do the job. But in my mind, that's what it equated to. And it's a real kind of stigma, I think, for kind of PR's got a lot to do around mental health. And I know that various organisations are trying to, like the CIPR and the PRCA, are trying to kind of address it. Because we have to deal with some really difficult situations, and we see a lot of things and know a lot of things that you can't unsee and unknow. So, of course, we're going to need help to kind of deal with that and to make sense of that. But yet there's this feeling that you've got to be indestructible. And I think definitely in that sort of emergency services environment, I definitely felt I had to be so super capable and indestructible, and spent the whole time going, I'm fine, because I didn't want anybody to think I wasn't able to do the job.
Was that a woman in a man's world kind of thing, an element of that in there?
Probably, yeah. I think when I look back on it now, and I've been sort of 5 years outside, so I kind of look back and think I'd adapted my behaviour and the way I viewed a lot of things to sort of fit and survive in that sort of environment. It is a very masculine environment. It's a lot of masculine energy. It's command and control, and it's very directive. Yeah. And I know, there are pockets where, there are elements of trying to change that and make a difference. And like even in the aftermath of the arena, trying to recognise the sensitivities of supporting people. But it is tough. And, I've read a lot of books on, being a woman in a man's world and all the rest of it since I left. And I noticed, microaggressions that people talk about and various things. And I'm like, yeah, I probably experienced some of that. Did it register with me? Well, probably. I think I pushed it to one side and carried on. I loved the job, so I was never going to not do it because of those sorts of feelings. But yeah, I think you certainly feel as though you've got to be 100% capable all the time.
Something like that terror attack, somebody working in our kind of little agency world like that, I can't begin to imagine what it must be like dealing with something like that. But did you have the tools, do you think, both mentally and the processes and systems in place to be able to kind of manage and get through it?
Yes and no. I suppose, and to a certain extent, yeah, you're working in that environment the whole time where serious incidents are happening. So you definitely have a level of capability to kind of deal with that. But I think I'd underestimated the impact. And I definitely, huge amounts of learning, lots of things. I talk a lot now about the things I got wrong along the way, and not recognising the impact on other people and on the team. I think, that was a real weakness because, yes, there was an impact on me, there was an impact on everybody else, but I'm not recognising where they are. I needed to validate their feelings. This is really tough. Yes, we'll get through it and we'll get through it together, but I needed to kind of almost validate that it is really hard, and I didn't do that. I'm also not very good at telling people bad news. Because I tend to go, oh, by the way, blur, and then they're going, huh? What's happened? So we did have a chief constable that died, and I remember telling the team, And I had a number of hours to comprehend what happened.
Yeah.
And then I needed them to stay late because of the work we needed to do. And I just went, I need you to stay late because the chief constable said. And carried on the conversation. And they're looking at me like, the what? And, you know, and it's things like that I think you've really got to...
You were talking as though that the number 7 bus is late tonight.
Totally. But I think there's a number of things in that. One, it's the kind of my head in the process of needing to do things, which is where I was at the start of the arena before the moment where I was explaining. But also I think there's a sort of, if you normalise it, it makes it less stressful. Yeah. You know, it's like the normalising this situation means that it's not big, huge and scary. It's manageable.
Yeah.
So I kind of see why my brain does do it, but perhaps it needs to not do it quite in the same way it does all the time. But to a certain extent, I can turn it to an advantage in the work I do now because most things don't worry me in the way that they might worry the organisation that I'm working with.
So we'll fast forward a little bit then. You left the police in 2020?
23rd of March 2020. And if anybody remembers that day, that was when I started the day going new life, self-employed person. And by sort of tea time, we were in lockdown. So that was interesting.
Yeah. So tell us about why did you go self-employed and what was this new venture going to do?
I think working in the police, I knew there was no other job I wanted to do. So for a long time, I'd said, when I leave, I'll work for myself. Yeah. That said, 2019 into 2020, I had a bad experience and what I classify as a bad divorce from the organisation. It wasn't a pleasant situation and I knew I wasn't going to continue to work there. So I ended up in the position of, I'm going to have to make this work now because I don't want to go and work for another organisation, but I'm not going to carry on working in that organisation. So I was lucky enough at that point to have been asked to write a book on crisis communication, which was gathering all the experience, I think, and the learning, particularly from the arena, and trying to make some sense of it that might help other people. So that was why I think I naturally kind of moved into, I'm going to do crisis communication consultancy, which all of the kind of voices in my head were going, don't do that, because you think, if I specialise so much, is there going to be work for me? Yeah. I need to do everything. And then I spoke to a number of people who have really been, I got so many people were so helpful. And like Rachel Miller, if people know, who does the all things I see, the internal comm stuff, and Advita, who I know you've spoken to before, and they were like, no, go with what you love doing, what matters to you, and what you're good at. So that's why I ended up, just setting up as a crisis communication consultant.
On the 23rd
of March 2020.
So was that? Some people might think that was a good thing because the world suddenly understood what a crisis was and the need for crisis comms. So was there a boon in work straight away?
No. In short, no. And I think there was a number of things. One, the bits of work that I had lined up went because the world had changed. Yeah. Even to the point that the book was due to come out in May. Then, because of the restrictions, they were like, well, we're not publishing books. And then they kind of went, oh, no, we do need to publish books. So it did get published in May 2020. But no, organisations were too busy trying to look at how they operated. So they were very inwardly and very inward focused. So I had a very challenging 6 months, 6 to 12 months to a year, where I was just taking whatever work I could. Luckily, I had enough to sort of just tide me over. But I hadn't really done any, I know people who go, I've put 3 to 6 months money aside and I had none of that. No.
Did you ever get to the point where you thought, I might have to start looking for a proper job, or did you just get through it?
Powered through it. No, I didn't. And it's funny, I was lucky enough in one respect that it was COVID, because one of the things that they put in place in Greater Manchester was a business coaching sort of service for small businesses, recognising the difficulties during COVID. So I had a business kind of coach. And I remember one of the first conversations, he was an amazing bloke. And I remember one of the first conversations was, what's your backup plan? And I went, I haven't got one. And he went, what do you mean? And I went, well, I haven't got one. I said, this is going to work.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably a good thing, because anybody who runs an agency or works in it, but you've got to be into it 110%. Yeah. You've got to be full in, because if you're thinking there's a backup, then you're not 100% on it. So yeah, so I was it was powering through and thinking there will be stuff there. I will find work. It will happen. I'm doing lots of things to sort of distract myself. So I still put lots of free things out. I do it all the time. Yeah. And I did a lot during COVID, a lot of online stuff, a lot of free webinars, a lot of kind of talking around things. And I think that sort of helps me to sort of keep sanity during what was a completely difficult time.
And do you now get people coming to you, asking for advice? I'm thinking about going solo. You've made it look so brilliant. So what should I do, Amanda?
I don't know whether I've made it look that brilliant, because I do talk about, I do. I'm quite happy to talk to people about a number of things. One, a difficult work environments and leaving difficult environments, because I had a really turbulent kind of time in leaving and damaged my confidence and lots of things. And so if anybody's going through sort of that, I'm more than happy to kind of talk to them to try and get them to see how they can take back control and deal with things. But also, setting up and all the things that people told me, which I now try and kind of pay back, and pass it on to people, because you need as many advocates as you can find when you're making a transition.
Yeah.
Because it's not easy. It's hard. And, I'm 5 years plus in now, just over 5 years. I still think I've not got much in the... Is there anything in the diary for August, September? Yeah. I don't think you ever get away from... last 18 months have been, like, super busy. And I am eternally grateful for that. It's almost like I put it out to the universe going, I'm happy with that. That's fine. But you're still looking for what's ahead, and you're still trying to think, have I got enough in the pipeline to sustain? So it is a challenging thing, but... and I know a number of people have probably said this, and I definitely heard Advita say it when I was listening to the podcast, is I am unemployable now. I think I've gone feral, because I do like the freedom to choose the work I do, to say what I want to about things that are happening, and, and pick and do different things, along the way. So, I'm not sure I could be put back into what I was doing before.
Well, tell us then, tell the listeners what it is you do now. What is the service that you offer, and who do you work with? Yeah,
it's really interesting, because I was trying to explain to a guy who came to fit some blinds at my home what the job was I did, because I was saying I was self-employed, and he was like, so what do you do? And so I tried to explain it, and he went, oh, you do emergency PR then? And I thought, there's a bit of a nub in that, I suppose. So I just do crisis communication, sort of focused works. That still means helping organisations who are perhaps about to face or are facing a crisis, and what they need to do, and giving them advice in that kind of respect. Doing training, which I do love, in kind of trying to explain to people, talk through things, and the ever-changing kind of world of comms as well, and how it relates to how we deal with kind of crisis situations. And I do crisis simulations, so, I like to do that as well, so kind of running people through real-life sort of scenarios to test them. And kind of everything in between, really. So everything that's in that sort of crisis world. I'm very lucky, because I love doing it.
What interests you about it? What keeps you the fire burning for you?
I think because there's so many times it goes wrong. I think that if you'd asked me this ages ago, like before the arena, It's like the arena was a big turning point for me in a lot of respects, and I liked the kind of the policing, how things worked, what you did, how you supported people, was helping victims and all that, and families and that kind of thing. I suppose when the arena happened, it made me realise that the crisis element is like when people are at their worst points in their lives. And organisations, whoever you work for or whoever you're working with, have got to get better at it if we're going to be able to really, help people get through things with as least kind of impact as possible, or just to try and improve things. And I think that's what drives me a lot now, is just that we've got to get better at this. Somebody said to me the other day, it's like a vocation for you. And I thought it is a bit, in that I am quite kind of like, here's why I think we've got to get this better, and this is what we need to do better. So I suppose it was always, from that point onwards in 2017, was always going to be where my head was. And the more you read about what's going on in the world, how comms is changing, polarisation, globalisation, the challenges of like the trust deficits, and then it makes it a really difficult working environment for everybody. So when something goes wrong, it's even more difficult to be able to deal with it in a really positive way.
Do you find that a lot of organisations have got crisis plans, but they don't know how to enact them, or they just don't have a crisis plan in place?
Yeah, you see everything. On a day-to-day basis, you see everything. So there are organisations and businesses that don't have crisis plans, don't have crisis management plans, let alone a crisis communication kind of plan. So you do see that. But as well, I think one of the other risks that is always there is complacency. So they've got something, but nobody really knows where it is or what it says or how they would operate it. So the crisis readiness, which is what's always talked about, and crisis preparedness, is a mindset thing as well. Are we in the right mindset that we think we could deal with something when it happens, and that we could respond to it when something went wrong? Because these things go wrong all the time. Things fail all the time. People do things all the time. And I think the other thing for sort of any comms and PR person is, you probably have that one moment in your career. It's like a career-defining moment, isn't it, where you have a massive crisis with a client or in an organisation, and how you respond to it can help you improve yourself and move on, or it can, really squash you and make you want to leave the profession and everything else. So I think it's really about feeling comfortable that you can face what might be around the corner.
You said a minute ago that people get it wrong all the time, and I don't particularly want to chuck stones at anybody, because they're but for the grace of God and that. But how do people get it wrong, I guess, is what are the common, oh God, what are they doing that for?
Oh my, yeah. I think the denial. We've not got a problem, honestly. Don't look here, look over there. There's a lot of that. I think it's a starting point for me. You've got to recognise you've got a problem, and then you can actually do something about it. But you do see that in some cases, through to trying to go, it's not as bad as you think it is. But from whose perspective? We've got to try and think about things, not just from that organisation's perspective. You've got to take yourself outside of the bubble that you end up in. Even whether you're in-house or whether you're working with a client, you can get kind of caught up in the bubble around how they operate and what they do. So you've got to kind of take yourself outside of that and go, what does this look and feel like to everybody else? Through to appalling messaging, there's lots of bits I share. I share one which always makes people's mouths kind of drop open, which was after the aftermath of the Uvalde school shooting, when the police chief was doorstepped, and he turns around and they say, you're going to speak to the families, and he goes, I'll speak to the families when they quit grieving. And I just think, there's bits like that which just...
Yeah, jaw-dropping.
Jaw-dropping. And you can understand why the brain's put some words together and it's come out. But the damage that something like that can do, and the impact that has on people. So it's all of that and everything in between. And I think complacency is an issue, but also it's about, being really as prepared as you possibly can be. So one thing people say, what was your major learning points from the arena? And one of the things for me was always the more preparation we could have done. As a comms team, we'd done a lot, but could we have done more? I'll always think we could have done more.
And you and I both started in regional newspapers way back in time now, when the world was different. Back then there were limited channels. Now we've got this proliferation of media. Surely that's just made the job so much harder.
Yeah, you're not going to say that we both started on typewriters with carbon paper, but yeah, that was a long time ago. Yeah. But it has. I mean, the world is a different place. If I think back to when I first was in police kind of comms, pre-2000, it was all media, bit of internal comms. We were all focused in a very specific way on getting messages out in a very specific press release type way. By the time I left, we've got all the social media stuff, artificial intelligence is just kind of on the horizon. And I think, when you look at social media, even in the time we've been using it and it's been there, it's transformed from, MySpace and all the rest of it, through to so many kind of channels now. And Twitter, even in the last, I call it Twitter still, I can't get that, but, in the last sort of 6 months to a year, has gone from being like a number one source of news and place where you would always put information out first to people aren't on there anymore, and they've come off, and the journalists aren't there in the way they used to be. So I think there's a huge amount of complexity to the fragmented nature of communication now, which makes jobs difficult on a day-to-day basis, doesn't it? Let alone then when you've got a crisis happens and you've got to think about, how do I get this message out?
And you talked earlier as well about trust, and that the way organisations and people are trusted or otherwise, and trusted sources of information.
Yeah, I think it's a post-pandemic, and you see it around the world. It's not just a UK kind of based thing, but you can see that people have a level of kind of distrust of authorities. There's a level of kind of questioning people in position of authority, which I don't think we've seen. And it's a legacy really from what we all experienced in different ways with lockdowns and the kind of aftermath and Partygate and all those other things. So you've ended up in a position where the profession you do could impact on how people feel about you. Do they trust you? I see the Trust Veracity Index I often talk about, because it gives you a flavour for, if you're in the medical profession, you're likely to have a slightly higher level of trust from people.
I'll have to butt in here and just tell Mrs. Garner that nurses are the most trusted profession, so she'll cheer for that one.
But then if you look at it, also you've got things like, policing, which is obviously where I've spent a long part of my working life, is been at a 40-year low, and it's only just above the man in the street, the man or woman in the street. So you've got that. How does that impact when you're trying to get messages out and talk about things? And ultimately, in a lot of cases, when you're dealing with a crisis, you need people to do certain things. And particularly for sort of emergency services and public sector kind of responders, you're going to say, shut your doors and windows, you need to leave, you need to evacuate your house. If they're not going to trust you, then they're not going to do it. And I think you've seen some of this play out in different parts of the world as well, with who's sending the message and do I trust that message, let alone whether that message gets to me in the first place. So I think there's a lot that we need to be really careful about how we do communications on a day-to-day basis, so that we're building the trust and that we are building that confidence, and protect that as much as we can. And I don't mean it in a kind of, I'm going to deny lots of things and hide things and all the rest of it. No. But I mean in a kind of, it takes a long time to build a good reputation and moments to lose it. So you really need to be investing. It's why we need to invest in comms and PR the whole time, really, so that the moment something happens, we're in a strong position.
It's interesting because obviously you can imagine that a police force would invest a lot of time and effort into comms and crisis comms planning, But for, the smaller clients that we might represent, the engineering business up the road or the school or the college or and so on, maybe less so. But I guess you've got a different take on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think every organisation is different. And I think I've worked with some big clients who are in risk-based industries that perhaps haven't got anywhere near the planning that you would hope they would have. So I don't think you can always assume, it's terrible to assume anything, isn't it? But can't assume that just because it's in a certain sector that they're going to be all over it and everything's going to be okay. But I think the way the world is now, we can see tiny little incidents that happen. It's like the butterfly effect, isn't it? Can have a massive impact in a whole sector, in a whole industry. Can go from being a little story to a global outrage over something. So when I'm working with all clients, and if they're a kind of, like you say, the small business, it's about being as prepared as you can be. We're not being ridiculous, but putting those steps in place that will provide you with a strong support if something does happen or if you do end up in that difficult position. And I think that's the best place to be.
What, in your eyes, does successful crisis leadership look like? What are the traits of a good comms person or a good leader in those situations?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I do talk about this in the first book. Bit of a plug. I shouldn't do that. But I put a whole chapter on the kind of leadership because I think it's really important from an organisation's perspective. It's that bit around ownership, taking responsibility, making decisions, which sounds like a ridiculous thing to say, but sometimes people get paralysed when something happens, even in senior positions. So this is why the kind of crisis scenario work is so important, because the more you've been through those difficult decision-making sort of experiences in a pressured but safer environment, then when you do have to do it for real, it isn't as problematic, So if you do get paralysis,
gives you that muscle memory.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's the key thing. They've got to be you've got to have people in a senior position who are good communicators, internally and externally. They've got to be visible externally and internally. I mean, it's a lot. We're asking a lot of, chief execs and senior people when something happens. And they've got to be really genuine and they've got to show empathy. They've got to have an emotional intelligence as well, which is a lot. And then from a comms perspective, if you're a comms kind of, to lead in that sort of situation, I think a lot of it's quite similar. I think it is about, being able to recognise what's happening within the team, which I wasn't very good at. And, you learn from those experiences. But I think it's about being able to spot where the problems are, being able to try and find solutions, making decisions, and having some emotional intelligence as well on a number of levels. And being able to, I suppose, digest a lot of difficult and challenging information and make it make sense in terms of what the plan needs to look like, what you need to put together, and how you need to operate for however long the crisis is going to last for.
You talked to me earlier about that. How long does a crisis last for? And that's an interesting topic in its own right, isn't it? And having that early warning thing and being able to deal with the whatever situation, but then looking into the kind of more longer term, or beyond the horizon of how do you get out of it.
Yeah, I think people underestimate how long crisis will impact on businesses and organisations. We focus a lot, don't we, in not just in kind of training, but in exercises on that, how to identify and how to respond quickly to that first moment, those first moments when something happens. We never really focus on what happens at the other end, which is when you're sort of have got on top of the situation and are trying to look at how you move forward. And I think we really neglect to think about the length of time it can take to rebuild a business, to rebuild a reputation, to correct inaccuracies that are misinformation that's circulated in the aftermath of it. And sometimes it can be generational, to really get back to where you want it to be. So I suppose from a comms perspective, when you've got senior people in businesses trying to power through and move ahead and are saying to you, well, just put some more good news stories out and we'll get over it. It's really about going, hang on a minute, it isn't like that, and it isn't going to be as simple as that. You go into a lot of detail about how do we want to be perceived, what's the damage that's been done, do we know, can we quantify what that looks like, and how can we use that to drive us into a changed way of working, or moving forward.
It's really difficult these days as well. I mean, we were talking again earlier about the idea that, okay, today's news is tomorrow's chip paper, but now these things live a life online, on YouTube, on internet pages, on social media feeds forever. So it's much trickier to kind of like think that it's just all going to be washed away, like you say, by a welter of good news.
Totally. I think, I think we talked before about the search engine optimization. I'm not an expert in that. But I think there's a whole element of how do you deal with what the legacy might look like. And it's why effective crisis comms is so important in the first place, because what do those things look like when they're still online, months and years later? And how can we be aware of the impact we're having for the future and when we're putting messaging together and dealing with things in the middle of a crisis?
And I'm curious, you dive into this world on a daily basis. Does it concern you, this post-truth, mainstream media being slated all the time, trust in police dipping, cyber criminals and rogue actors and states like Russian interference in elections, all of that into the mix? How do you sleep at night?
I was going to ask, it's, when you put it like that, you're like, yeah, I suppose. I think I go probably back to what I said earlier about I just normalise it.
Yeah.
So I just go, that's the way the world is. So I don't kind of, there's no point, I try and do shout at, to be fair, I shout at the television sometimes, I shout at the news sometimes. But there's a bit of, that's the way it is. So things like fake news, there's no point me moaning about it. It's there, it's happening, it will happen. It will happen every time there's a crisis. It will happen every time there's an emergency. What can we do? That's the bit, is I'm trying to move to, I suppose, a bit like a good comms person, you move to solution. What the solution to this problem that I've got? So I think that's the way I try and approach it, is I'm always looking at the solution side of the way the world is. It is challenging. I think I am getting much better at, than I used to be about recognising where people are. It is really challenging. And I've said a number of times, that 2025 feels harder than I think a long time. Even back into, think of 2020 and lockdowns, that was hard. But this feels hard in a much different way. Information's being weaponised. Yeah. Information's being used, been manipulated. And at senior levels, at very serious senior levels. And I do think that we're going to find communication, PR, comms, what the work we do is at the front line and put under pressure in a way that I don't think any of us probably have experienced. And you probably would have to go back to the Second World War to propaganda and how things were kind of operating then. So I think it's being really aware of the environment that we're working in and that we live in. But I sleep okay at night because I feel as though, every day I try and do my bit in some way, and try and help in some way, or try and add value in some way. So I suppose that's what keeps me kind of okay. And I've got some preparations. I have my 72 hours worth of food and water.
I'm going to ask you about the future now, and regular listeners to the podcast will realise that Tony's about to wrap up now, and because I'm going to ask you to get your crystal ball out and just what you think the future might hold for crisis comms, particularly in the kind of like rapid changing world that we're in, and the advent of AI and generative models like that, etc.
Wow, that's a big question. Where do I think things are going to go? I think we're going to have more challenging times ahead. I think I'm really aware of that. I think the trust, the ethics of communication, the ethics of PR, I think that's going to come to the fore. We've talked about it a lot, haven't we? You know, as an industry, as a profession, for a number of years. We've all, been reading and learning about ethics and testing ourselves on it. I think we're going to find ourselves tested quite seriously on lots of levels in the time ahead, whether it's short term or slightly longer term. Are we propagandists or are we communicators? And where's the line between things? So I do think that, I don't want to be... I feel like sometimes I go into conversations and I depress everybody. So I don't want to do that. But I do think this is going to be where we'll earn our money. Yeah. We're not just going to talk about it. We're going to live it. And we're going to have to make decisions on things and where we want to be on things. So that, I think artificial intelligence, I try and look at the positives of it, because I do think there's some massive benefits that it brings, and definitely brings to the crisis communications kind of approach, and the way it can kind of crunch data and trends, and how it can kind of support in lots of different ways. If I'm honest, I'm not going to have one of Elon Musk's domestic robots in my house, because that scares me. And I think some of that element of things does worry me a little bit, but perhaps that's because I'm still back in my typewriter with carbon paper, and I don't necessarily want to head into that world. But yeah, I think I keep looking at the challenges that I do think are going to come, certainly for the rest of this year and perhaps into next, as we can be part of the solution rather than the problem.
And if you were asked to give advice to somebody who is entering the profession now and thinking about a career in police comms or crisis comms, what would you say to them?
Oh, I don't do it. No, I don't mean that. I think the first thing is, if you're thinking about the police comms side of it, go and try and get an experience of it, feel what it looks like, because it is that Marmite job. And you might find it's not the thing for you. If it is the thing for you, it can be fantastic. And there are some great people doing great work. I think you've spoken to Liz Langston, and I've known her a long time, and she does amazing amounts of work. So get to feel it. That's the key thing. I think in terms of crisis comms, I wish more people would, and definitely more diverse range of people would come into crisis. Crisis comms tends to be very male. In lots of respects, quite a male-dominated sort of arena to be in, and it lacks a lot of diversity. So, I think it needs that diversity, because it needs a diversity of thought, and it needs people championing different perspectives and different viewpoints. So, I would say, speak to people who are doing it. If it's something, if you like it, you'll love it. I think this is probably a bit Marmitey as well. If you like it, you'll love it. If it's not for you, I say I'm rubbish at event management. I can tell you all the problems that you could have with an event, but actually putting on an event, I am not the person to get to do it. We've all got our kind of skill set. But if if you feel as though you've got the skill set for crisis, talk to somebody who's doing it, because, hopefully it might be the right place for you.
Perfect. Well, I think that's a fantastic place to leave it. We could chat all day, but I think Jack needs to get his bus home. So thanks so much, Amanda, for your time, and it's been an absolute pleasure, and hopefully really illuminating for our listeners out there.
Thanks very much.